الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيد المرسلين يا خاتم النبيين يا شفيع المذنبين يا أنيس الغريبين يا رحمة للعالمين صلى الله عليكم وعلى آله وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I was uncertain what to talk about today until this morning. It kind of hit me. Today is the 2nd of Safar, and so this is the day that Imam Zayd bin Ali, the son of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, who is the son of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So this grandson of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was martyred on the 2nd of Safar in the year 122 Hijri. So that's, inshallah, we'll talk about him. But before we go into him, just a few words on the month of Safar itself. And of course, the month of Safar is the month between Muharram and Rabiul Awwal. So, second month in the Islamic calendar. And this is a month which is associated with a lot of difficulties. There are people who deny this because of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he said there is no Safar. But, so they allude that, or they say that, oh, see, because it was commonly accepted amongst the Arabs before Islam that this was a month of difficulty. But Safar also refers to a star that, the Arabs associated with a bad omen. And so that is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was talking about. If you look at the Safar itself, there are narrations where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talks about difficulties during this month. But the thing is, for the mu'min, for the true believer, difficulties do not equal bad. In fact, for a believer, for a true mu'min, everything is good. So, because when the difficulties come, that is a chance for him to exhibit his patience and steadfastness, and so that raises his ranks. The last Wednesday of this month is actually referred to indirectly in Surah Qamar. So Surah Qamar is Surah number 54. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the people of Ad. So you have to remember Ad was an ancient Arabian civilization. These people predated the people of Thamud. So the people of Thamud are famously, the people of Salih alayhi salam, the ones who killed the camel of Allah. And so so they were annihilated. And if you read the Quran, one of their issues, or one of the things, was that when Salih alayhi salam warned them of the punishment of Allah, he would warn them and remind them of the people of Ad before them, then they would say, one of their excuses was that these were people who were living in the open, because the people of Ad were destroyed through this wind. And they said, because the people of Thamud lived in the mountains, and they carved homes in these large mountains, large carvings of these homes, which still exist today. And we know where they are because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed by the ruins of Thamud when he was coming back from Tabuk. And he told the companions not to go into that place. And those who had already gone and gotten some water and gotten some stuff from there, he told them not to use this because this was a place where the curse of Allah or the wrath of Allah descended. So stay away from this. So we know clearly where the people of Thamud were. it is disputed as to exactly where the people of Ad were. And even during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the people of Ad were in sort of a myth. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Hud alayhi salam to them, who warned them, and of course they did not heed the warnings. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a wind as a punishment for them, the storm that came and punished them and destroyed them. And so some people say that this is in the southern part of modern day Jordan where this occurred. But others attributed this to an area in modern day Oman. Because they, again, these are people whose ruins truly had not been found, except for about 75 years ago, they found some ruins in Ad that were covered by sand, which would go along with the concept of this wind and this torment coming over them, or this storm coming over them and destroying them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to that destruction of theirs in verse, of course, in verse 18, he says, Ad also rejected the truth, and then how dreadful was my punishment and warnings. And he says, indeed, we sent against them a furious wind on a day of unrelenting misery, which is Yawm Nahsim Mustamir, day of unrelenting misery or misfortune. And so a lot of the scholars of the Tasawwuf, they say that this day that is mentioned here was actually the last day of this month of Safar, or the last Wednesday of the month of Safar. And so, this is why we ask Allah's protection always, also during this month. But again, for the true believer, there's only good. Because for the true believer, that's an opportunity for him to rise in the ranks. So that's, in relation to this month of Safar. But on the second of this month is the martyrdom of Imam Zayd bin Ali, who is the son of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. So Ali is the actual name of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Zayn al-Abidin is one of his kunyas, or one of his titles. Sajjad is another one of his titles. And so we'll talk about Imam Zayd somewhat today. But to understand him, we have to understand his background, his environment. How was he raised? In what environment was he raised? And of course, he's raised in that household, which is the best of households. Not just questionably the best household. He is raised in the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He is one of the sons of this household. So when we look at his father, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, so Imam Zayn al-Abidin is, of course, as we mentioned before, the only true adult male survivor of Karbala. He was too sick to fight. So Imam Hussein al-Islam sends him, he wanted to fight, he tried to get up to fight, could barely stand, with his sword. And Imam Hussein al-Islam sends him back into the tent, tells him, no, this is not for you. He, at that time, Imam Zayn al-Abidin at that time is, roughly about late teens, maybe early 20s. And so when these people were taken prisoners, when the household of Rasulullah were taken prisoners, so you have to understand the conditions that they were put through. And we've talked about these to some extent, but again, they were treated as common prisoners. Not just common prisoners in reality, they were treated as enemies of the state. It's one thing you're a common prisoner, you stole something, you did this. Your treatment is very different than if you're an enemy of the state. You look at any country, the punishment of treason or is death. The and prisoners who are taken, or people that are taken prisoner and accused of revolting against the state, and especially when it's an empire, where and a kingdom where you have this authoritarian rule, then these people are subjugated to a lot of torture and misery. The captors go out of their way, to subjugate the captives to torture and misery. So when the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is the best of households, when they were taken prisoners, so you have one rope or one chain that would tie their hands, go around their necks, tied their feet, and then they would be tied to the donkey or the camel that they were riding on. And then they were paraded from city to city, from town to town, all of these places. The women, again, were treated like prisoners. With the exception that Imam Hussein al-Islam had made dua before his martyrdom, that, "Oh Allah, do not allow the household of this woman, or the women of this household, to be subjugated to certain extremes that they would go through, the prisoners could possibly go through." But they still, were paraded around like prisoners. So the clothes, the covering of the head and the face was not there. And Imam Zayd al-Abidin is a witness to all of this. He is forced to be a witness to all of this. And so eventually, they are, he makes it back to Medina Munawwara, but of course life in Medina is not comfortable either. And we'll get to that in a second. There are three people who historically are known in the world to have cried the most, to have shed the most tears. One, of course, is Adam alayhi salam. 300 years that he cried, asking for Allah's forgiveness, and not attaining that position until he arrives in Arafah. So that's 300 years after he has come to this earth. He's walked the earth. He's walked from what is modern day Sri Lanka, across the ocean, all the way to India, across all of modern day India and Pakistan and Iran and Iraq, and finally down to Makkah, or next to Makkah in Arafah, where his tawbah is finally accepted when he uses the wasila and he is reminded of the names that he had forgotten, of those 5 names that he had forgotten. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds him. He has this eureka moment where all of these names come rushing back to him. And now when he asks for forgiveness, now this is the state when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to him. But 300 years non-stop crying. After that, we have Yaqub alayhi salam. And Yaqub alayhi salam, after Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam is taken away from him. So Yusuf alayhi salam is taken away, and out of the difficulty or the sadness of the separation, even though he knows that Yusuf alayhi salam is still alive. And you read the Quran and it becomes very apparent. He knows Yusuf alayhi salam is still alive. He does not believe the story that his sons have told him. Yet he cries for decades until he loses his sight. So he loses his sight just crying over that separation. And the third is Imam Zayd al-Abidin, as far as those who have cried the most on this earth. and constantly tears running down his cheeks. And when the people asked him, why is this your condition? And he says, because their point is, well, these are martyrs. Yes, they're martyrs. Yes, Allah has given them this better life, but just the separation. And he says, in his response, he says that, Yaqub alayhi salam cried until he lost his sight, even though he knew Yusuf alayhi salam is still alive. And before my eyes, I saw 19 people of this household being slaughtered. And then their bodies being mutilated. What do you expect? What do you want? So, Imam Zayd is born into this household. Imam Zayd is the much younger brother of Imam Muhammad Baqir. So Imam Muhammad Baqir it's like an 18, 19-year difference between the two of them. Imam Zayd, according to scholars, was born the year 80 Hijri, so roughly about 19 years after Karbala. And so according to some, maybe a little bit before, but most around 80 Hijri. He is anywhere between 3 to 6 years older than his nephew, Imam Jafar Sadiq. So there's very little differences. The difference between Imam Zayd and Imam Jafar Sadiq, between uncle and nephew, is like the difference between Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Amir Hamza radiallahu anhu. The uncle and the nephew there. Okay, so the same age difference, roughly 3 years. And Imam Zayd, again, he's growing up. And the other thing you have to understand, about Imam Zayn al-Abidin, as I mentioned earlier, when he returns to Medina Munawwara, things are not smooth. Just like when his uncle had returned to Medina Munawwara, Imam Hassan al-Islam, things were not smooth. And with Imam Zayd, what happens is, you have, and as we just to kind of quickly go over the background here, the historical background as far as just what's going on. Okay, Karbala happens, about several months after Karbala is finally when Imam Zayn al-Abidin returns to Medina Munawwara. And then after that, you have the revolt that occurs in Medina Munawwara. Yazid sending his forces, or right around that time, Yazid sending his forces to Medina Munawwara. They ransack the city. They, pillage and plunder and, abuse the women and all the things that they did, and just massacre the people in Medina Munawwara. He's a witness to this as well, right? So this is when Abdullah ibn Zubair stands up and rises up and assumes the rule, and the people support him. And now Yazid's forces attack Makkah Mukarramah. So year 64 Hijri is when Yazid is attacking Makkah, and during that siege of Makkah is when Yazid dies. Okay. Then his son Muawiyah is made the king. The son was a decent person, and he said, how can I accept this rule or this throne when I've seen what my father did to the household of Rasulullah to attain this? And a few days later, they find him conveniently dead in his room. Then you have an internal struggle within Banu Umayyah and between the Safwani Umayyads and the Marwani Umayyads, and Marwan bin Hakam eventually becomes the king. However, by this time, Abdullah ibn Zubair has solidified his position in many parts of the Ummah, because everyone was tired of Yazid and what they had done. So for 9 years now, Abdullah ibn Zubair basically controls most of the Ummah. Not really, well, I shouldn't say controls, but he he reigns over most of the ummah, okay, or most of the empire. But then you have, people rising or revolting against him, and eventually Hajjaj is sent. So the year 72 Hijri, Hajjaj is sent, Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who basically comes and lays siege to Mecca and eventually kills Abdullah ibn Zubair, and then, and so takes over, and Banu Umayyah regains control. Okay, so you have 9 years there where you might have had some sense of minor stability. And even within that sense of minor stability, things are always up in the air as to what's going to happen. Now you return back to the instability for the true believers. And so and of course they look at Imam Zayn al-Abidin as a prime enemy, Banu Umayyah does, and someone who is, in a position where if people start to rally around him, then that becomes a major threat to their empire. Okay. So they've, of course, even when they sent him back, he was blacklisted. So anyone who would meet with him was subject to punishment from the state. And if you go into certain countries, you know that, okay, if you do certain things, if you meet with some people, okay, you're going to have people coming after you. If you say, basically globally, you use certain words, right? And suddenly, you're subjected to, a lot of issues with the governing bodies. Suddenly you get a knock on the door, you get this, you get that. You get all of these issues that come up just for using certain words that aren't even, hateful words. They're just words. So it was, with Imam Zayn al-Abidin, it's even that much worse, because he is that figure that, again, if the people were to rally around him, then that would be it for the state. And the state understands this, and this is why what they'll do is, and when Marwan became king, he was only king for just a few months, right? Like 9-10 months, and then he dies. He was in his 80s when he became king. His older son Abdul Malik becomes king after him. Okay. Abdul Malik is the one who found Hajjaj bin Yusuf, or discovered Hajjaj and the potential of Hajjaj for his state. And he's the one who sent Hajjaj against Abdullah ibn Zubair, radiallahu anhu. Okay. So now, after, the whole empire is now back under the control of Banu Umayyah. So what they'll do is periodically they will send for they will send for Imam Zayn al-Abidin. And we'll get back to who he really is in a moment. And they would come and he would be put in chains and drug all the way from Medina back to Damascus. Put in prison, interrogated, tortured, and then eventually sent back to, Medina. And then a few months later, same thing. Okay? Because they wanted to show we're in control. We can do anything we want to. And this basically this was a show to the people to keep people in line, right? Don't do anything against us. It's interesting, there was a scholar, a decent scholar amongst the Tabi'i, Imam Zuhri, rahmatullah alayh, who accepted position within the court of Banu Umayyah. Most decent scholars would not accept that position. But he accepted it because he wanted to be a voice of reasoning, or he thought he could be a voice of reasoning amongst all of the chaos. And maybe he could kind of, steer things slightly in the right direction. So instead of them coming and massacring everyone, maybe they'll just kill a few people. That was his hope. He wasn't under any delusion that, he's going to fix everything. He just wanted to kind of be kind of a stabilizing voice within, because kings surround themselves with people that are going to tell them what they want to hear. But he wanted to be that one voice that kind of reasoned with the other side of the mind. So one time when Imam Zayn al-Abidin is handcuffed, and basically when they'd handcuff you again, it wasn't just your arms, it was your feet. You were shackled, and you'd be brought up there, and he was put in jail. So Imam Zuhri came to meet him, and he says, he apologized. He said, "I'm sorry because of this condition and what they're putting you through and all of this." And Imam Zayn al-Abidin is listening to him for a while. And then he says to him, "Do you think I'm in this condition because, they have authority over me?" He shook his hands and his feet, and the chains fell off. He says, "This is the position I have accepted for the betterment of the ummah, in order to teach the ummah, to teach them sacrifice." This is what they're teaching us. Teach them sacrifice and never to end the struggle against oppression in whatever form you can do it in. And to sacrifice for that struggle. And if you look at this household, the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they gave life to the tree of Islam through their blood, through their sacrifices. Each and every one of them. They were true representatives of the Quran. You see this connection of theirs to the Quran. They were, the living Quran. So we can't forget this. But this is, again, this environment, when Imam Zayd is born, alayhi salam, this is the environment that he's growing up in. That he is connected to those, and not just connected to those, he is connected and he is from those who are connected to the Quran and who are the Quran. So now when Imam, again, he's growing up, eventually the year roughly 95 Hijri, which is when Imam Zayd will be roughly about 15 years old, is when they will martyr Imam Zayn al-Abidin by poisoning him. And because Abdul Malik, he keeps getting wearier, and these, you have to understand, these kings are very paranoid as well. They're always looking over their shoulders as to who's coming after their power or their position. So eventually he will be martyred this way. So he grows up, Imam Zayd is growing up seeing all of this. He grows up in this environment of knowledge. He grows up in this environment of patience, of hilm, forbearance, steadfastness, all of these things, and the struggle against oppression, all of these things that the Quran embodies. This is where he is. This is who he is. One of the ways, and we've talked about this before, and I'll just mention this right quickly. One of the ways that Imam Zayn al-Abidin got around the blacklisting, because decent scholars had a hard time coming and meeting him. Decent people had a hard time coming and meeting him. So what he would do would be every Ramadan he would buy 1,000 slaves. He would put them through this intensive course, teach them Quran, fiqh, sunnah, hadith, tasawwuf, all of these things. And then after 1 year of this intensive training, he would free them and send them back to wherever they were from. to go and teach, and with permission to go and teach. And he would give them enough wealth when they were going back. You think about this, okay, you're a slave, you just got freed, you don't have anything. But he, again, this foreseeing of what needs to happen, he would make sure they had the wealth to go back and be in a position where they could teach without being controlled by somebody else because they're having to ask for handouts. And they would get wherever they came from, Yemen, Sham, Africa, various parts of Africa, the Far East, wherever they were from, they would go back and start teaching. And this is the essence of tasawwuf. And this is why, if you were here that night we had our program, I mentioned that there were originally two forms of tasawwuf. Tasawwuf Sunni and Tasawwuf Salafi. And Tasawwuf Salafi ended with Imam Malik, rahmatullah alayhi. Okay? But Tasawwuf Sunni is through Imam Zayn al-Abidin. And this is what is continuing even today. Okay? And so this is what he would do. So again, you can imagine, or rather we can't even imagine, the knowledge that Imam Muhammad Baqir and Imam Zayd are receiving from their father. Yeah. When I come to the title of Zayn al-Abidin, Zayn al-Abidin means the zenith of the worshippers. Okay, Abid, we translate it as worshipper, but Abid is from Abd. The one who humbles himself, the one who is the slave of his Lord, who worships with humility. This is what ibadah. Ibadah is humility. You can't be arrogant and worship. I mean, these are two opposite terms, right? So he is the zenith of the worshippers. He is known as Sajjad because he would make 1,000 rakat additional salat throughout the day or the night. And when the nights were long, he would make 1,000 rakats of additional salat. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for him would extend the night. These are amongst their miracles, like the Miraj. When we talk about the Miraj of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all of these things happened, within a moment. And so for these people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for us, it's like, you can't, there's not enough time to get things done. For them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extends the time because they are so engrossed in His worship. But Zayn al-Abidin, a lot of people think, this is a title given to him by the people. Yeah, but Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in reality used this term for him even beforehand. Even the title of Baqir for Imam Muhammad Baqir was given to him. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had already mentioned that title beforehand. Yeah. And so, like for Imam Zayn al-Abidin and Imam Muhammad Baqir, the narration is that Imam Hussein al-Islam walked into the masjid when he's very young, 3, 4, 5 years old. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in the masjid with Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu. And he says to Jabir, as Imam Hussein al-Islam comes close to him, and he takes him in his arms and he kisses him and he lays him down in his lap. And he says to Jabir, he says, "Oh Jabir, this son of mine will have a son. And on the day of judgment, a crier, meaning one of the angels, will come forward and cry out, O Zayn al-Abidin, or Sayyid al-Abidin, come forward and enter Jannah." And he will come forward and take with him a multitude to Jannah. So, and then he says, that son will have a son whose name will be upon my own. Which means what? Muhammad. And he says, "Oh Jabir, you will meet him, and when you meet him, give him my salam." And so, and he, in another narration, had told Jabir radiallahu anhu that son, to whom he's to give the salam, will be Baqirul Ulum, will be Baqir. He will split or go through the depths of the knowledge. And so Imam Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu would at times, he had lost his physical sight, and he would call out in the masjid, "Oh Baqirul Ulum, the depths of the knowledge, where are you?" Until finally one day he hears the footsteps, and this is mentioned in Sahih Muslim, where he hears these footsteps coming, and he says to his students, he says, "I hear the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And I've gone over this several times, so I won't go over this again. Okay. But again, these titles aren't just, the people just gave them titles. No, these are titles confirmed and affirmed by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is who they are. Even the coming of Imam Zayd, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had already foretold this. So Imam Zayd's mother is actually from Sindh, modern day Sindh. So she's from the subcontinent. She was captured in one of the battles. Mukhtar of Thaqafi brought her to Medina and gave her to Imam Zayd al-Abidin as a gift. Imam Zayd al-Abidin frees her and marries her. And from her, he has Imam Zayd. Okay. So Jodha was her name. Radiallahu anha. Okay. So again, Imam Zayd is growing up with this knowledge, right in front of him. He's not just a witness to the knowledge, he is living the knowledge. He is a witness to those living the knowledge. He himself is living the knowledge. He grows up in this household that is an example of this patience, an example of this struggle against oppression. And so it's interesting that when he was born, they came and gave his father the news that, a son is born. You have a son that is born. And so his father, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, opened the Quran. And when he opened the Quran, the verse that came before him was verse 111 of Surah Tawbah. And the verse starts off with أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله اشترى من المؤمنين أنفسهم وأموالهم بأن لهم الجنة. That Allah has indeed purchased the believers' lives and their wealth in exchange for Jannah. Yeah. Then he closed the Quran. Then he opened the Quran again. And now the first verse that is in front of him is the verse of Surah Al Imran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. That do not even think of those who have been slain in the way of Allah, that they are dead. But no, they are alive and they receive their sustenance. And then he closed the Quran again, and he opened it, and he came to the verse, and I'm blanking on the verse, the exact verse number, but where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those who struggle in the way of Allah are not like those who do not struggle. And then he closes and he says that I have been given the condolences of the martyrdom of this child. or I've been given the news rather, not condolence. I've been given the news of the martyrdom of this child. And so when Imam Zayn al-Abidin himself is martyred through poisoning, the silent or the secret martyrdom, Imam Zayd, as I said, was roughly 15 years old. And his brother, Imam Muhammad Baqir, is, again, as I mentioned, almost 20 years older than him. Okay. And, of course, he's under the tutelage of his older brother now. Even though he's 15, so technically he is an adult. Knowledge, of course, is something that's everlasting. And you never know enough. And these are people who understood. Again, these are not people simply who read the Quran, but these are people who lived the Quran. Okay? And their connection to the Quran was such that one of the titles of Imam Zayd is Hilful Quran, the ally of the Quran, the friend of the Quran. One time a man came to Medina Munawwara and wanted to find Imam Zayd, and he asked somebody, he says, just listen to where the Quran is being recited and you'll find him. Wherever the Quran is, that is where you'll find him. Because again, they weren't just reciting it. Like we open it and we read it and it's just words for us. This wasn't just words for them, this was life for them. This was their existence. This is what separated them from everybody else. This is why Rasulullah ﷺ said that I'm leaving behind two very heavy things. And if you adhere to them, if you stick to them, then you will never go astray. One is the Quran, which is light and guidance, and the other is my household. Because he understood, Rasulullah ﷺ understood and knew that mankind will always be in need of guidance. And even though you have the companions, he didn't say the companions, but you have the companions. You have great companions like Abu Bakr Siddiq, radiallahu anhu. Great companions like Umar Farooq, radiallahu anhu, Uthman Ghani, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, all of these great companions. But their greatness was with them. It was not something that they transferred on. Other than those who associated and became, students, but again, it's not something that was transferred on. This household, their greatness is something that is transferred on. Those who are the true heirs of this household. So even today, people are in need of guidance. And those who connect themselves to this household, directly or indirectly, those are the ones who will be guided. They are the rope of Allah, because they are intertwined with the Quran. So these are things that should be very clear for us. But so when Abdul Malik became, when he died, I guess, late 90s Hijri, then his son Walid took over. And Walid was even more of a tyrant than his father Abdul Malik. So you had Walid in Damascus, you had still Hajjaj in Iraq, and you have one of their other cousins, Uthman, in Egypt. And Umar bin Abdul Aziz, rahmatullah alayhi, who at this time was the governor of Medina Munawwara, he made a statement. And he's from this household, so you have to understand, this is an internal person saying this. This isn't some outsider saying this. So this is somebody who knows the inner workings of his household and knows how corrupt and just evil it is. And he makes a statement. He says, Walid in Sham, Hajjaj in Iraq, and Uthman in Misr. The world is under oppression, is being oppressed. All right. So he understood what types of tyrants these people were. After Walid died, his son, or his brother, Suleiman, became the king. Again, son of Abdul Malik. So Abdul Malik had several sons, and they will be successors with the exception of Umar bin Abdulaziz that will come in between. When Suleiman dies, Suleiman has some reservations about what all he's done. So he asked his advisors, is there any way that I can be forgiven for all of these things? And they said, yes. They said, leave the affairs of the Muslims to someone decent and righteous. And so that's why he sought out his brother-in-law and cousin, Umar bin Abdulaziz, and made him the king after himself. Umar bin Abdulaziz, rahmatullahi alayhi, would consult with Imam Zayd. So one of the people he would consult with as far as, questions of fiqh, questions about the state, and questions about everything was Imam Zayd. Because of his level of knowledge. And we'll come to that point in a little while. Of course, after Umar bin Abdulaziz, rahmatullahi, who only ruled for roughly a little over 2 years, the cousins got together, right? They realized that, our wealth is we can't loot and plunder and do all the things we were doing anymore. So they saw a reduction in their wealth and, of course, their authority and their power, and they want to regain that. So they eventually poisoned Umar bin Abdulaziz, and then Yazid II becomes the king. And then after him, Hisham bin Abdul Malik will become the king. So when Hisham becomes the king, he really ratchets up all of these things as far as the oppression and the tyranny. Hisham is just one of those ruthless people, those, even from a young age, just extremely ruthless and would do anything for power and wealth. He is the one who was, if you remember, and we've talked about this a long time ago, he is the one who was the Amir of the Hajj during his father's rule, when Imam Zayn al-Abidin came, and of course the story or the incident is that this delegation or the lead, he's sent as the Amir of the Hajj. Arrives in Mecca with this huge delegation. Of course, they have to have their entourage. He's a prince, to in line of the succession of kingdom, or to be king. And they arrive in Mecca, and he tries to go and kiss the Hajar Aswad, and there's so many people that he gets knocked around and pushed back and eventually pushed out, right? So what he does is he sets up this platform, or he has his men set up a platform, and they get on that and they sit and they watch the people making tawaf, and they look at the Kaaba, because looking at the Kaaba, of course, is ibadah. That's the only ibadah they know. For them, yeah, we've done this, so this compensates for our killing everybody else and fighting against the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what happens in the meantime is that Imam Zayn al-Abidin comes. make tawaf. And when Imam Zayd al-Abidin arrives, the people split like the splitting of the sea with Musa alayhi salam, and give him a straight path to go and kiss Hajar al-Aswad. And he goes and he kisses the Hajar al-Aswad, and then he starts making tawaf. And Hisham makes the comment to the people around him. He says, "Who is this?" It's kind of a derogatory way of saying, "Yeah, who is this guy?" I mean, So Farazdak, who we've talked about recently, Farazdak is there because he is the poet, the official head poet of the state. So he's the propaganda machine for the state. But Farazdak does have some connection, and not an insignificant connection to this household as well. And at that time, his decency comes out, and he says to Hisham, because all the other guys that are there, even though they know who it is, they say, "Yeah, who is this guy?" Because they want to repeat what the king or the prince just said, right? Oh, we got to show that we're in line, right? We want, "Yeah, who is this guy? Who is this guy?" So Farazdak, he stands up, and now he says his most eloquent and most famous poem in honor of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, where he says, "What do you mean, who is this? You know who he is." And then he goes into the poem where he says, the earth knows that he walks on knows who he is, the Kaaba knows who he is, the skies know, everything knows, the birds know who he is. He talks about his greatness and the greatness of his household and the lineage that he comes from. Of course, he's imprisoned for that, but that's a different story. So this is the same Hisham, okay? So this Hisham eventually becomes the king. And again, the atrocities now just skyrocket. Okay? And especially atrocities against the household of Rasulullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Imam Zayd, being who he is, being this representative of the Quran, and if you read the Quran, if you understand the Quran, you will see how the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks in the Quran against oppression in all forms. Constantly talking against oppression. So he's not just reading the Quran, he's living the Quran, right? So he discusses things with his nephew. Again, there's only three years, at the most 6 years, but 3 years difference between the two of them. Imam Jafar Sadiq and Imam Zayd. Imam Zayd discusses, what he's planning on doing. Because again, there are people in Kufa that are saying that they're ready to go against, the status quo. And so he comes to his nephew and they discuss things. And Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, he says to his uncle, he says that if you are willing to be killed and your body be crucified in the public square, then do as you're planning. And so he set out. Again, these are people who are willing to give their blood to nourish the tree of Islam. He is willing to walk the path that his grandfather walked, knowing what's coming, being that mujahid. So he sets out. Of course, Kufa is at this time one of the centers of learning because Abdullah ibn Masud, and then, in reality, because of the coming of Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajh to Kufa. Okay, so it is one of the centers of learning. So he arrives in Kufa, And this is when Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi meets him and speaks to him and becomes his murid, his disciple, and gives him allegiance, gives him bay'ah, hand in hand. So when this happens, Imam Zayd is getting the army ready. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi gives him 30,000 dirham, which according to cattle prices today, because you could buy a cow for 3 dirham, cattle prices have gone up significantly, so that would roughly come out to about $15 million today. Okay. He gives this to him as a gift to prepare his army. For those who tried to make Imam Abu Hanifa look like somebody who was opposed to standing up to the state, if you look at the life and the actions of Imam Abu Hanifa, they go totally against that notion. Banu Umayyah, when they realize something's up, they come to Imam Abu Hanifa and ask him, they offer him the position of Chief Justice. But the position comes with a price. And the price is that he gives a fatwa against Imam Zayd. So Imam Abu Hanifa will be offered Chief Justice position 2 times after this, and that will be by Banu Abbas. And eventually he will be killed for not accepting it. But they come to him because they want a fatwa against Imam Zayd, and they offer him to be Chief Justice. And he outright says to them, he says, "Ana min shi'atihi," which literally means that I am from his party. I have accepted him. I am his supporter. I mean, that's what that means. I am his supporter. And clearly he says, I've given him this much money as a gift to fight against you people. So Imam Zayd, starts, I guess, gathering and making arrangements for the army. And you have all these people that come, and roughly, about 10,000 people that sign a ledger saying that, we support you. When it came time for his army to go out, you only had 8,000 people in the army. So 2,000 right away didn't even show up. Imam Abu Hanifa told most of his students that could go to go and join his army. He himself wanted to join the army, but Imam Zayd said, no, you got to go back and continue this process of learning and teaching so that the true knowledge will get passed along, so that people will understand the reality, not just the superficial movements of the worship in this. So when he leaves, and actually, even before he leaves, one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa that joined the army, when he joined the army, his mother came running to Imam Abu Hanifa saying that, look, you said this to your students, and my son, who is my only son, he joined the army, and he's my only son, and if something happens to him, then we won't have any lineage, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa himself, and there are other narrations of this reference as well, he draws the analogy of the actions of Imam Zayd as the actions of Rasulullah ﷺ in Badr, by saying that, do you not wish that your son be raised amongst the martyrs of Badr? Yeah. So when they go, they set out, and they just get to the outskirts of Kufa. You have to also understand that the governor of Kufa and were also against him. So you have spies everywhere, right? Relaying messages to the prince, the king, and everybody, and the generals that are coming against him. Okay. When they get to the outskirts of Kufa, there are people from his army that come to him. These are generals within his own army, leaders within his army, right? Who come to him and they say to Imam Zayd that, look, we're willing to give our lives and our wealth for you. We're willing to die for you. But we want you to do tabarra, or to curse Abu Bakr and Umar, radiallahu anhu. So his response to them is, he says that, how can I say anything against those about whom I don't know anything but good, and I have not heard anything but good from my forefathers about them. Whenever my forefathers spoke about them, they said nothing but good. Not a single word that could be taken to mean something bad. And we've talked about this before, but I'm going to go over it again. Why did he specifically reference his forefathers? Because if he had not, then those people could have said to him that, oh, you have abandoned the way of your forefathers. But he knows the way of his forefathers better than they know the way of his forefathers. Again, he was raised by his forefathers. They're the ones who taught him. He says this, so now they don't have anything to come back to him with. Who are his forefathers? His father is Imam Zayn al-Abidin. His grandfather is Imam Hussein al-Islam. His great-grandfather is Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajh. His great-grandmother is Bibi Fatima salamullah alayha. His great-great-grandfather is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when he says this, they accuse him. Rawafid means the one who's abandoned the way, right? The one who's turned against. So they say, oh, you are Rawafids. And he says, no, you are the ones who are Rawafids. You're the ones who abandoned the way. And so they abandoned him, and he's left with 313 men. When he's left with 313 men, his men now come to him. And they say, look, because the army of Hisham that's coming against him is anywhere from 10 to 20,000 men. So 10 to 20,000 men against 313, do the math. It's not hard to do the math there. So you know what's coming. So they say to him, look, we will hold them off as long as we can. You get out. Go and you can regroup or whatever, but get out. And his response to them, he says, look, your advice is sincere and your advice is good. You're giving me good advice, and you're giving it to me sincerely, and I acknowledge that. But he says, but I can't accept it. And they say, look, if you're acknowledging that our advice is sincere and that it's good advice, then why can't you accept it? He says, because you have the example in my household of going into the battle. You don't have any example of my household running away from the battle. Eventually the battle starts. He is martyred. He knows what's coming. He's martyred. His son Yahya, will eventually bury him right there at the river's edge where the water comes over a little bit, hoping that Banu Umayyah won't find his grave. Banu Umayyah finds his grave after the battle. They dig up the grave. They behead him, sent his head to Sham, and they crucified the body. Just as his nephew had said, if you're willing for this to happen, then do what you're doing. You're doing what's right, but this is what the outcome's going to be. And the interesting thing is that his body, when they crucified his body, they would turn it a certain direction. And slowly over time, his body would turn and face the Qibla. And they would come back and turn it again. And then over time, it would face the Qibla again. And they would turn it again, and this was a routine. The body was crucified for 4 years, which also tells you it didn't rot, because by 4 years, every bone should have fallen apart. After 4 years, the new king, after Hisham dies, Walid II becomes the king. He has the body pulled down and burnt, and then the ashes, into the Euphrates. The origin of the Euphrates and the Nile is the sixth heaven, which is where the roots of Sidratul Muntaha are. So his ashes were thrown into the Euphrates. When we look at him, Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi said about him, he said that I never met a man more knowledgeable amongst his generation than Imam Zayd. He will say the same thing about Imam Ja'far Sadiq. But this doesn't mean, Imam Ja'far Sadiq was more knowledgeable. It equates their knowledge. These are people who are drinking from the same source. These are people who have been immersed in the same vessel of knowledge, whose knowledge transcends time and space, and whose knowledge is not simply limited, like we try to dissect, and separate, Islam and the rest of science and world and all of this other stuff. Their knowledge these were true Imams. And you look at Imam Ja'far Sadiq, you look at Imam Zayd, Imam Muhammad Baqir, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, Imam Hussein, Imam Hassan, Imam Ali, alayhimus salam. These are true Imams in the true sense of the word. And of course, today, most people don't understand what that means. For most people, Imam is simply somebody who leads the Salat. Okay. Person leading the Salat should be knowledgeable about the Salat. That is the requirement. Okay. He doesn't have to be the most knowledgeable, but he should have the knowledge of the Salat and how to lead the Salat, and if he makes a mistake, what to correct, and all of these things. But he doesn't have to have knowledge of all the other things. But true Imam is the one, when you ask him, he doesn't say, I don't know, because he already knows. So when we look at these Imams, the Imams of this household, these are Imams in the true sense of the word Imam. That their knowledge is so vast that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened the doors of knowledge to them. And this is why when Imam Zayn al-Abidin, when he's on that pulpit in Sham, and he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has distinguished Ahlul Bayt, this household, with 6 characteristics. And the first thing he names is ilm, knowledge. And then hilm, which is forbearance, which includes sabr and steadfastness, patience and steadfastness. And then, of course, generosity, eloquence, bravery, and then love in the hearts of the believers. All right. So when Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam was asked about his uncle, Imam Zayd, his response was that he was amongst the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the most knowledgeable and the most on the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imam Ali Rida, he says about him, he says that he fulfilled the rights of the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Hajj, he says at the beginning of verse number 78, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ, and strive in the way of Allah as he, subhanahu wa ta'ala, deserves that you should strive. That is the right to strive. So he fulfilled the rights of striving in the way of Allah. So again, when we look at Imam Zayd, we look at a man who is intertwined with the Quran. He is amongst those who is a walking, talking, living Quran. So then we look at his life and we see his struggle against oppression, his sacrifice for this struggle. You know, it's not just, oh, he struggled against oppression, but he sacrificed for that. You know, it's easy for us that, oh, you know, yeah, I'm struggling. Well, struggle means sacrifice. What are you sacrificing for this? What have you given up for this? And when we look at ourselves, you know, it's interesting when Rasulullah ﷺ spoke about the Khawarij. He says to the companions, he says, when you see them, you will be ashamed of your worship compared to their worship, right? And the same thing applies today when we see them because they recite the Quran so well and all of these things, make so much salat and fast so much and, you know, make 50 hajj. But we should truly be ashamed when we look at these people, when we look at their humility, their struggle, their sacrifices, you know, all of the things that they did. Then we should take heed of all of these things. But I guess I'm going to end here because time's almost up. You know, it's kind of interesting. Well, I always say I'm going to end and then I say a few other things. So it's interesting, you know, like I was listening to one guy and he says certain decent things, but then there are other things. But he was saying, you know, like, how do you define, like these days, how do people define a Sunni? And the thing is that the definition he was using was really more of those that are the modern day Khawarij. True Sunni is the one who loves Allah and His Messenger and loves the household of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then honors and respects the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And how can you love the household if you don't know who they are? If you don't know the sacrifices and the struggles they went through, just so the deen would reach us. You know, for the preservation of this religion. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to know them, to love them, to acknowledge them, and to follow them. Any questions? So inshallah I'll end here today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us again to know them. May He fill our hearts with His true love and the true love of His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family, which is this household, and his companions and all of those whom they love. And may He, you know, give strength and victory to our brothers and sisters in Gaza and Palestine and wherever the Muslims are being oppressed throughout the world, and allow us to acknowledge the oppression and to struggle against the oppression. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum.